A hunter finds bear cubs in his backyard, but the real shock came days later. The morning light filtered through the towering pines that bordered Walter Gay's property, casting long shadows across his meticulously maintained garden. At 73, Walter still rose with the sun, a habit formed during decades of hunting expeditions across the southern woodlands. Now those early hours were dedicated to tending his vegetables and flowering shrubs instead of tracking game through misty forests. Walter knelt beside a row of tomato plants, his weathered hands gently securing the young vines to wooden stakes. Despite the arthritis that plagued his joints, there was a grace to his movements, a careful precision born from years of handling rifles and tracking wildlife. The irony wasn't lost on him, how the same hands that had once taken life now nurtured it. "Breakfast is ready, Walter," Lillian called from the back porch, her voice carrying across the yard. 68 years old and still spry, Lillian Gray had been Walter's companion for nearly 5 decades. She understood the demons that haunted him, the invisible weight he carried on his shoulders. Walter stood slowly, brushing soil from his knees. "Coming, Lil." Their home sat at the edge of Gainesville, Texas, where suburban development gave way to stretches of woodland. It was a modest place, a single-story ranch house with a wraparound porch and a shed that had seen better days, but it was theirs. A sanctuary Walter had built with his own hands after retiring from his construction job 15 years ago. Over breakfast, eggs from their own chickens and toast made from Lillian's homemade bread, Walter gazed out the kitchen window at the treeline beyond their property. His mind drifted, as it often did, to that fateful day 12 years ago in the East Texas piney woods. The memory was vivid, preserved with cruel clarity, the crisp autumn air, the sound of leaves crunching beneath his boots, the flash of movement through the trees that he'd mistaken for a deer, the deafening crack of his rifle, and then the terrible realization, a black bear, not a buck, lying wounded on the forest floor, her cubs barely visible, cowering behind a fallen log. Walter had tracked and hunted for over 40 years without incident. He prided himself on his ethics, his precision, his respect for the animals he pursued. But one careless moment, one hasty shot, had shattered that record and changed him forever. He'd managed to save the bear, radioing for a wildlife officer and veterinarian, staying with her until help arrived. But the image of her eyes, filled with pain and fear as she tried to protect her cubs, had never left him. After that day, Walter hung up his guns for good. His hunting rifles now gathered dust in a locked cabinet, relics of a past life he couldn't quite reconcile with the man he'd become. "You're thinking about it again," Lillian said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Walter nodded. Words weren't necessary between them anymore. 47 years of marriage had given them a shorthand, an understanding that transcended the need for explanation. "Maybe you should call Pastor Mike," Lillian suggested. "It's been a while since you two talked." "Maybe," Walter conceded, though they both knew he wouldn't. Pastor Mike had tried for years to help Walter forgive himself, but some wounds ran too deep for spiritual balm alone. After breakfast, Walter returned to his garden while Lillian drove into town for her weekly bridge game with friends. The solitude suited him. Among his plants, with his hands in the soil, Walter found a measure of peace that eluded him elsewhere. It was nearly noon when he first heard the commotion, a clatter from behind the shed where they kept the compost bin. Probably raccoons again, Walter thought, reaching for the broom he kept on the porch for just such occasions. He rounded the corner of the shed, broom raised, prepared to shoo away the usual masked bandits, and froze. 3 bear cubs, each about the size of a beagle, were scattered around the appended compost bin. 2 were pawing through the spilled vegetable scraps, while the third, noticeably smaller than its siblings, was attempting to climb into the bin itself. Walter's breath caught in his throat. Black bears weren't common in this part of Texas. They existed primarily in the eastern regions of the state, and even there, encounters were rare. Yet here were 3 cubs, boldly foraging in broad daylight. Before Walter could process this unlikely scene, a low rumbling growl emanated from the tree line. His blood ran cold. Where there were cubs, a mother was never far behind. She emerged from the shadows of the forest, a full-grown female black bear, her dark coat gleaming in the midday sun. She was large, perhaps 300 pounds, moving with powerful grace toward her offspring. Walter remained perfectly still, his mind racing through everything he knew about bear encounters. Don't run, make yourself look big, back away slowly, but his feet seemed rooted to the ground as the mother bear's gaze locked onto him. It was then that Walter noticed it, a distinctive scar on her left hind leg, a jagged line where fur didn't quite grow properly, a scar that matched the wound he treated with trembling hands 12 years ago in the piney woods. Impossible, his mind protested. The statistical improbability was staggering. And yet, as the bear's dark eyes met his, Walter felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Matilda," he whispered, the name coming unbidden to his lips. The bear, Matilda, tilted her head slightly as though puzzled by the sound. She made no aggressive move, merely watched him with what Walter could only describe as weary curiosity. One of the cubs, the smallest one, squealed as it tumbled from the compost bin. Instantly, Matilda's attention shifted. She huffed, a sound somewhere between warning and encouragement, and the cub scrambled to gather behind her. Walter took the opportunity to retreat, backing slowly toward the house, his heart hammering against his ribs. Once inside, he rushed to the window, expecting to see the bears fleeing back into the forest. Instead, Matilda had settled near the compost pile, watching her cubs resume their foraging. With shaking hands, Walter reached for the phone to call Lillian. "Bears?" Lillian repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "In our yard." "A mother and 3 cubs," Walter confirmed, his eyes never leaving the window. "Black bears." "And, Lil?" I know it sounds crazy, but I think she's the same bear from that day in the piney woods." A pause. Then Lillian's voice, gentle but concerned. "Walter, honey, that was hundreds of miles from here. And years ago. She has the scar, Lil. On her left hind leg. Exactly where," his voice caught, "exactly where I shot her." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm coming home," Lillian said finally. "Don't do anything until I get there." But Walter couldn't tear himself away from the window. He watched as the cubs playfully wrestled, as Matilda patrolled the perimeter of the yard, as the smallest cub, the one that had tumbled from the bin, received extra attention from its mother. Something about that particular cub tugged at Walter's heart. It was clearly the runt, smaller and less coordinated than its siblings, yet Matilda showed it special care, nudging extra food its way, grooming it more frequently. By the time Lillian's car pulled into the driveway, the bears had retreated to the shade beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the property. They showed no sign of leaving. Lillian joined Walter at the window, her hand finding his shoulder. "Oh my," she breathed. "They're beautiful." "The little one," Walter pointed to the smallest cub. "I think it's a female. The other 2 are male." "You've been watching them that closely?" Walter nodded. They don't act like wild bears, Lil. They're too comfortable around the house. Around me. What should we do? Lillian asked, practical as always. I've been thinking about that, Walter replied. We should call Wildlife Services. I know that. But, he trailed off, unable to articulate the strange reluctance he felt. Lillian studied her husband's face, reading the conflict there. But you don't want them taken away. Is that foolish? They're wild animals. They could be dangerous. Lillian smiled, the gentle expression she reserved for moments when she understood Walter better than he understood himself. I think, she said carefully, that some things happen for a reason. If that really is your bear. Matilda, Walter supplied. If that's really Matilda, then maybe this is meant to be. A second chance, of sorts. Walter's eyes stung. A second chance at what? That's for you to figure out, Lillian said, squeezing his shoulder. But we should still call Wildlife Services. They need to know there are bears in the area. Even if we don't want them removed. The Texas Wildlife Conservation Department sent Jake Morrison the following morning. Tall and lanky, with the sun-weathered face of a man who spent most of his days outdoors, Jake arrived in a state-issued truck loaded with equipment. Mr. and Mrs. Gray, he said, shaking their hands firmly. I understand you've got some unexpected visitors. Walter led Jake to the back of the property, where the bears had established what appeared to be a temporary den beneath the old oak tree. They watched from a distance as Matilda dozed while her cubs explored their surroundings. Well, I'll be damned, Jake murmured, lowering his binoculars. A mother with 3 cubs. Haven't seen black bears in this part of the county and, well, ever, actually. Are you going to relocate them? Walter asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Jake scratched his chin thoughtfully. That would be standard procedure. But this is an unusual situation. They're not showing signs of aggression, and they've chosen a location that borders natural woodland. He glanced at Walter. You mentioned on the phone that you think you recognize this particular bear? Walter recounted the story of his hunting accident years ago, the wounded bear he'd helped save, and the distinctive scar that convinced him Matilda was the same animal. When he finished, Jake was silent for a long moment. That's quite a coincidence. If true, he said finally, almost too remarkable to believe. I know how it sounds, Walter admitted. Strange thing is, black bears are typically very wary of humans, especially ones who've had negative encounters. For her to deliberately settle so close to your property. Jake shook his head. I've never seen anything like it. After further observation, Jake proposed a compromise. Instead of immediate relocation, he would install wildlife cameras to monitor the bear's behavior. The department would assess the situation over the coming weeks before making a decision. I'm going against protocol here, Jake confessed as he set up the first camera, but something about this situation feels special. I'd like to understand it better before we intervene. He turned to Walter. Would you be willing to help observe them, keep a log of their activities, feeding patterns, that sort of thing? Walter agreed readily, relieved at the reprieve. Strange, Jake remarked before leaving. I've never seen a bear choose to live so close to humans, but maybe there's something about you that makes her trust. After Jake departed, Walter found Lillian in the kitchen preparing lunch. He's leaving them for now, Walter announced, unable to keep the relief from his voice. Lillian smiled knowingly. That's good news. I'm supposed to observe them, keep notes. Just like your hunting journals, Lillian noted. Except now you're tracking them to protect, not pursue. That afternoon Walter retrieved an empty notebook from his desk drawer, the same kind he'd used for decades to record his hunting observations. With careful precision he began to document the bears' presence, the time of day they were active, their feeding habits, the distinct personalities of each cub. The smallest cub, whom Walter had taken to calling Dot because of a white speck of fur on her chest, fascinated him most. Despite her size disadvantage, she showed remarkable determination. She was the first to explore new areas, the quickest to figure out how to access food sources. In all ways, Matilda watched over her with special attention, ensuring she received her share. Over the following days, Walter established a routine. Each morning he left a carefully measured amount of appropriate food, fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, at the edge of the property, not close enough to domesticate the bears or make them dependent, but sufficient to supplement their foraging and keep them from straying into neighboring yards. He observed from a distance, never approaching, always respecting the invisible boundary Matilda seemed to establish. She appeared to recognize this restraint, this respect for her space, and gradually allowed her family to venture closer to the house when Walter was present. Jake Morrison visited weekly, reviewing Walter's notes and checking the camera footage. Remarkable, he commented after the third visit. They're displaying socialization behaviors I have never seen in wild bears. It's almost as if they recognize you as not a threat. Lillian, who had been initially cautious about their wild neighbors, found herself drawn into Walter's fascination. She began joining him for his morning observations, bringing her sketchpad to capture the cubs' playful antics. "I've named them all," Walter confessed to her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the bear family prepare for night. "The biggest male is Ash, see how his fur has that grayish tint? The middle one is Benny. And the little female, Dot," Lillian finished, smiling, "because of that white spot on her chest." "You've mentioned her before." Walter nodded, slightly embarrassed. "Is that silly, naming wild animals?" Lillian shook her head. "No, Walter. I think it's healing." And it was. With each passing day, the heavy burden Walter had carried for 12 years seemed to lighten incrementally. The bear's presence, Matilda's presence, was slowly transforming his guilt into something else, something that felt remarkably like forgiveness. But nature, Walter knew better than most, was unpredictable and often cruel in its indifference to human sentiment. The storm arrived without warning one June night, a violent tempest that tore through Gainesville with savage intensity. Thunder cracked overhead as rain lashed against the windows of the Gray household. Walter and Lillian huddled in their living room, listening to the wind howl through the trees surrounding their property. "The bears," Walter said suddenly, sitting upright. "They've been sheltering in the old shed." The shed, a dilapidated structure that predated their purchase of the property, sat directly beneath the massive oak tree where the bears had first established their presence. As if in response to his concern, a tremendous crack split the night, louder than the thunder, more terrible than the wind. The sound of splintering wood, of tearing earth, followed immediately by a crash that shook the very foundation of their home. Walter was on his feet in an instant, moving toward the back door. "Walter, no!" Lillian cried, grabbing for his arm. "It's too dangerous." But Walter was already pulling on his rain jacket, his face set with determination. "I have to check on them, Lil." That sounded like the oak outside. The rain was a solid wall of water, driven horizontal by the gale-force wind. Walter staggered through it, flashlight beam cutting a feeble path through the darkness. What he saw at the edge of the property stopped his heart. The massive oak had indeed fallen, its ancient roots torn from the sodden earth. It had crashed directly onto the old shed, crushing the structure beneath tons of wood and foliage. And there, in the beam of his flashlight, was Matilda, bleeding from a wound on her shoulder. She was frantically pawing at the wreckage, trying to reach something beneath her cubs. They were trapped under the collapsed shed. Walter could hear their frightened cries now, barely audible above the storm. One voice in particular, higher, more desperate than the others. Without conscious thought, Walter sprinted toward his garage. Inside, hanging on the wall where it had remained untouched for 12 years, was his old hunting rifle. He grabbed it, pausing only long enough to remove the barrel. With quick, practiced movements, what remained was essentially a sturdy metal rod with a wooden stock, no longer a weapon, but a tool. Back at the fallen tree, Walter approached Matilda cautiously. She whirled to face him, teeth bared, then, astonishingly, backed away. Not retreating, but making room. Walter wedged the barrelless rifle beneath a heavy beam, leveraging his weight against it. The wood groaned but didn't budge. He repositioned and tried again. This time, the beam shifted slightly. A small dark shape squirmed through the newly created gap, Ash, the largest cub, muddy but apparently unharmed. Moments later, Benny followed, scrambling to his mother's side. But Dot remained trapped, her cries growing weaker. "Come on, little one," Walter grunted, straining against the lever. "You can do it." Suddenly, another pair of hands joined his on the makeshift lever. Lillian, soaked to the skin, her gray hair plastered to her face, pushed alongside her husband. Together, they managed to lift the beam high enough for Walter to reach beneath and gently pull Dot to safety. The tiny cub lay limp in his hands, barely breathing. Matilda approached, her massive head lowering to sniff her injured offspring. Walter held perfectly still, the cub cradled in his palms, as the mother bear inspected her child. After what seemed an eternity, Matilda raised her eyes to Walter's. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition that transcended the natural barriers between their species. With infinite care, Walter placed Dot on the ground before her mother. Matilda nuzzled the cub gently, then looked back at Walter. The rain continued to pour around them, but neither moved. "She knows," Lillian whispered beside him. "Somehow, she knows you're trying to help." The moment was broken by the arrival of headlights cutting through the rain, Jake Morrison's truck, followed by another vehicle Walter didn't recognize. Jake leapt from the cab, raincoat flapping. "Got your message," he shouted over the storm. "Brother Ramirez from Wildlife Rehab." Dr. Elena Ramirez, a compact woman with efficient movements, assessed the situation quickly. The mother's injured, shoulder wound, possibly broken. The small cub doesn't look good either. "Can you help them?" Walter asked, his voice cracking. "Yes, but we need to sedate the mother first. It's not safe otherwise." Jake prepared the tranquilizer gun while Dr. Ramirez explained the procedure. "She'll be aggressive when she sees the gun. You folks should get back to the house." But Walter shook his head. "I'm staying." As Jake raised the tranquilizer gun, Walter moved to where Matilda could see him clearly. He stood at the edge of the porch, directly in her line of sight. Their eyes met, hers wild with pain and maternal protection, his steady with a silent promise. Matilda didn't charge. She didn't flee. She watched Walter as the dart struck her flank. As the sedative began to take effect, her massive body swayed, her eyelids drooped, but her gaze never left his face. "She knows you won't hurt them," Jake whispered as Matilda finally collapsed onto her side. In the hours that followed, Walter and Lillian's kitchen became an impromptu veterinary clinic. Dr. Ramirez worked tirelessly treating Matilda's shoulder wound and examining each cub in turn. Dot had suffered a broken leg and possible internal injuries, but was stable for now. "They'll need specialized care," Dr. Ramirez explained as she packed her equipment. "We'll transfer them to our rehabilitation facility near Austin in the morning." "And then?" Walter asked, dreading the answer. Jake and Dr. Ramirez exchanged glances. "Once they've recovered, they'll be relocated to Sabine National Forest," Jake said gently. "It's black bear territory, part of their natural range. They'll be safer there." Walter nodded, his throat too tight for words. It was the right decision, the only decision, but the prospect of losing Matilda and her cubs left an unexpected hollow in his chest. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Fallen branches littered the yard, and the mass of oak lay like a slain giant across the remains of the shed. But the air was clean, washed by the rain, and the first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon. As the wildlife team prepared to transport the sedated bears, Walter stood silent, watching. 12 years ago, he had wounded a bear through carelessness and spent over a decade seeking absolution. Now, having helped save the same bear and her family, he felt the first stirrings of what might be peace. The rehabilitation center provided regular updates on Matilda and her cubs. Their recovery was swift. "Black bears are remarkably resilient creatures," Dr. Ramirez explained. Matilda's shoulder had not been broken, merely deeply lacerated, and with proper care, she healed well. Dot's injuries proved more serious, requiring surgery for internal bleeding, but she too showed signs of improvement. 6 weeks after the storm, Jake Morrison arrived at the Gray. The household received news. "They're ready for relocation," Jake announced. "The transport team is taking them to Sabine tomorrow morning." Walter received the news with mixed emotions. He was genuinely happy for the bears. They belonged in the wild, in their natural habitat, far from the encroaching threats of human development, and yet their departure felt like the closing of a circle that had only just begun to form. "I've got something for you," Jake said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a photograph in a simple wooden frame. "Thought you might want this?" The image, captured by one of the infrared cameras Jake had installed, showed Matilda standing at the edge of the Gray's property. She was looking back over her shoulder, directly at the camera, her eyes reflecting the infrared light like twin moons. Written on the photo frame in Jake's angular handwriting, she looked back. Walter's hands trembled as he accepted the gift. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "You know," Jake said thoughtfully, "in 15 years on this job, I've never witnessed anything like what happened that night when you stood there in the rain and she just watched you, like she knew you were trying to help." "She did know," Lillian said with a quiet certainty. Jake nodded slowly. "Maybe so. There's a lot about these animals we don't understand." He hesitated, then added, "The department officially records this as a successful intervention in an urban wildlife conflict, but off the record, I think what happened here was something special. Something worth remembering." After Jake left, Walter hung the photograph in their living room where the morning light would catch it. Beneath it, he placed his barrel-less rifle, no longer a weapon, but a symbol of transformation. The days following the bears' relocation were difficult for Walter. He found himself automatically scanning the tree line each morning, listening for the familiar sounds of cubs playing. The yard seemed emptier somehow, as though it had grown accustomed to its wild visitors and now mourned their absence. Lillian suggested they channel their energies into rebuilding. The fallen oak needed to be cleared, the crushed shed replaced. Walter threw himself into the work, finding solace in physical labor. He salvaged what wood he could from the oak, carefully cutting and seasoning the timber. Some would become furniture, he decided, some would be used to build a new structure where the shed had stood, sturdier, more substantial. A shelter, he explained to Lillian as he showed her his drawings, for whatever wildlife needs it. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn yielded to winter. The new shelter stood completed at the edge of the property, its roof solid, its walls insulated against the cold. Walter stocked it with fresh straw and continued to leave food at the forest's edge, not for bears now, but for the deer, rabbits, and other creatures that called the woodland home. Jake Morrison visited occasionally, bringing updates from his wildlife monitoring. Black bear sightings had increased across East Texas, he reported. The population was slowly recovering after decades of decline. Any word about Matilda and her cubs? Walter would inevitably ask. Jake's answer was always the same. They've adapted well to their new territory. The last tracking signal showed them deep in the forest, right where they should be. Walter accepted this with a nod, both disappointed and relieved. Disappointed that the connection he had felt with Matilda had been severed, relieved that she and her family were thriving in their natural environment. The first snow of winter came early that year, a light dusting that transformed the gray property into a wonderland of white. Walter rose before dawn, as was his habit, and stood at the kitchen window with his morning coffee. Something caught his eye, a disturbance in the pristine snow near the new shelter. Setting down his cup, Walter pulled on his coat and boots and ventured outside. Tracks crossed the yard, bear tracks, 3 sets, each distinct in size and pattern. Walter's heart raced as he followed them from the forest's edge to the shelter, around to the food station he maintained, and back toward the trees. In the hollow of an old sycamore at the property line, Walter discovered something that stopped his breath, a scrap of yellowed paper, weather-worn and tattered, bearing traces of his own handwriting. He recognized it immediately, the note he had written years ago and placed in a hollow tree in the piney woods, a letter of apology to the bear he had wounded, to the forest he had violated, to the natural world he had wronged. The note was damaged now, torn and clawed as though by a curious paw, but it was unmistakably the same paper, somehow transported across hundreds of miles and years to find its way back to him. Walter sank to his knees in the snow, tears freezing on his cheeks. Maybe they haven't forgotten, he whispered to the silent forest. And maybe they've forgiven. When he showed the paper to Lillian, she held him as he wept, not tears of sorrow this time, but of release. The burden he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. That evening Jake Morrison arrived in response to Walter's call. He examined the tracks with professional interest, measuring and photographing them before confirming what Walter already knew. 3 bears, a large female and 2 nearly grown juveniles, had visited the property. The smallest set of tracks, Jake noted, shows a slight irregularity in the right front paw, consistent with an old injury that healed imperfectly. Walter said softly. Jake straightened, brushing snow from his knees. I can't explain how they found their way back here from Sabine. It's over 200 miles, through urban areas, across highways, impossible by any rational standard. He gazed toward the darkening forest. And yet, here are their tracks. Before leaving, Jake paused on the porch steps. "In 15 years on the job," he said, echoing his words from months before, "I've never witnessed a moment like the night you met Matilda's eyes. Nature accepted your apology, not in words, but in action." As the winter deepened, Walter continued to find occasional signs of bear visitation, tracks in fresh snow, claw marks on trees at the forest's edge, never the bears themselves, but evidence of their passing, like shadows at the periphery of his awareness. He maintained his routine, leaving food and ensuring the shelter remained clean and accessible. But now, there was a lightness to his movements, a peace that had been absent before. In the spring, Walter expanded his garden, adding flowering plants known to attract pollinators. He installed bat houses in the tall pines and created a small pond for frogs and aquatic insects. Slowly, deliberately, he was transforming his property into a sanctuary, not just for bears, but for all wildlife. Lillian supported his efforts wholeheartedly, often working alongside him despite her arthritis. "You found your purpose," she told him one evening as they sat on their porch, listening to the chorus of spring peepers from the new pond. Walter nodded, his gaze drawn to the forest edge where he had last seen bear tracks. "I spent most of my life taking from nature," he said reflectively. "Now I'm learning how to give back." The following autumn marked a year since the storm that had changed everything. Walter and Lillian held a small gathering to celebrate the anniversary, not of the destruction, but of the redemption that had followed. Jake Morrison attended, along with Dr. Ramirez from the Wildlife Center and Pastor Mike from their church. As twilight descended, the conversation turned inevitably to the bears and the extraordinary bond that had formed between a former hunter and the animal he had once wounded. "I've been thinking about it," Jake said, nursing a cup of Lillian's apple cider. "Why Matilda came here, to your place, specifically." "I've wondered that myself," Walter admitted. Jake leaned forward in his chair. "Bears have incredible spatial memory and a sense of smell that puts bloodhounds to shame. But what Matilda did goes beyond that. She didn't just remember you, she sought you out, trusted you. And then, even after relocation, she found her way back, at least for a visit." "What are you suggesting?" Pastor Mike asked, intrigued. Jake shrugged. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive. I'm just saying that sometimes, in my line of work, you witness things that don't fit neatly into scientific categories. Things that make you wonder if there's more to these creatures than we understand." Dr. Ramirez, who had remained quiet through much of the evening, finally spoke. "In veterinary school they teach us not to anthropomorphize animals, not to attribute human emotions or reasoning to their behavior." She paused, swirling the cider in her cup. "But in 20 years of practice, I've seen too many examples of animal behavior that defy simple explanation. Elephants mourning their dead, crows bringing gifts to humans who feed them, and now a bear who remembers a man who once harmed her, then saved her." "Forgiveness," Pastor Mike suggested softly. "Or something very like it," Dr. Ramirez agreed. Later, after their guests had departed, Walter and Lillian stood together at the edge of their property, gazing into the darkened forest. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Texas sky. "Do you think they'll come back?" Lillian asked, her arm linked through Walter's. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But it doesn't matter. Not really. They've given me something I couldn't give myself." "Forgiveness," Lillian echoed Pastor Mike's word. Walter considered this. "That, yes, but also purpose. A reason to keep going, to keep trying to make amends." He gestured toward the sanctuary he had created, the garden, the pond, the shelter. All of this came from that moment when Matilda looked into my eyes and didn't see an enemy. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder. From one who once inflicted pain to one who became trusted, she murmured. You found your redemption, Walter, not only with nature, but with yourself. Walter nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The weight he had carried for so long had been transformed, not erased, for such things never truly disappear, but reshaped into something that strengthened rather than burdened. In the distance, from the depths of the forest, came the faint sound that might have been a bear's huffing call. Perhaps it was merely the wind through the pines, or perhaps it was something more. A reminder that in the natural world, cycles of harm and healing continue endlessly, and that redemption, like forgiveness, is never finished, but always in process. Walter listened until the sound faded, then turned with Lillian toward their home, carrying with him the lesson Matilda had taught him, that even the deepest wounds could heal, given time and the courage to face them directly, and that sometimes the path to forgiveness led through the most unexpected wilderness.